Hey, this is Mr. Ng going over the Precalculus Chapter 4B test on 4.4, 4.5, 4.7, taken on April 6, 2018. This is version C, max score out of 75. Question number 1, find the amplitude of y equals -5 cosine 3x minus pi. If you write out your letters, y equals a cosine b x minus c. Here you actually don't need to factor out to find your b value. This is just the amplitude, so that is the coefficient in front. Now pay attention, the biggest distractor would have been -5. You have to take the absolute value of that. Absolute value of -5 is a +5, and that is why the choice is E. Question number 2, find the phase shift of the function. So if I take this and I have y equals cosine of x minus pi over 2, you're basically a phase shift. You're looking for the c value after it's factored. So in this problem I gave you a pretty easy one where you don't have to factor anything. And then here you're just looking for the c value. So pay attention that the formula has the parentheses same. One thing that's different is c is equal to pi over 2. So that would be a shift of a pi over 2, a positive. Question number 3, if sine, the inverse of sine of 5/8 equals a, then blank. So here capital A is a angle, and it's telling you we need to find an angle based off of the two sides. The two sides I have are from sine. So there, if I just take the inverse, remember you're going to take the inverse sign and turn it off because you're switching it, then you have sine of A equals 5/8. That would be the first choice here. You're not doing anything silly such as you're not taking the reciprocal. That would be incorrect. Here, don't think that the inverse means taking the cofunction or reciprocal identity or the cofunction identity, anything silly like that. Don't do anything. Question number 4, find the exact degree measure of arc tan -1. So arc is just another word for saying the inverse of tangent. We're going to set it equal to x, so I can do the switch. Then I'm looking for locations where tangent of x equals -1, where we have this acronym. All students take calculus, and all the trig functions are positive in quadrant 1, and in quadrant 3, tangent is also positive, but I'm looking for a negative, so that would be in quadrants 2 and 4. Now, anytime it's a +1 or -1, it's going to be your 45s. So there would be 135 and 315. But if you pay attention, 135 and 315 are not in our range for the inverse of tangent. So if you either circled 135 or 315, that would have been incorrect. So that would have been the number 1 distractor. And the reason why on a C level I gave you guys this chart, so if you didn't have that in your formula sheet, A's and B test versions didn't have this, you're looking for between -90 and 90. We had to restrict the domain, and so then that becomes our range of the restriction domains. So we're looking for an answer between -90 and 90, but none of these answers, 135 or 315, are in there, so you can just do a coterminal angle. Coterminal angle means same position, just a full rotation. In this case, if I subtract 360 degrees, let's see if I can get that in there. If I subtract 360 degrees, I get -45. If I subtract 360, that would be too much. Not on one of my choices. And if I add 360, it doesn't get into that range. So only this one does. And that'll be -45 is your answer. Question number 5, I give you guys a 4x4. Can look for the freebies. 4 there. That was 4 or 1. And then the front side was out of 30 points. Here's an example where the student on question number 2, they just see the -pi/2, and that's what they're going to write. Remember, write out the letters A, B, C, and D, and that would be helpful. Here's another example of the student not writing out the letters A, B, C, and D, and they just think, oh, amplitude is in the very beginning, and then they circled this one is your choice, but that's incorrect. Remember, you have to take the absolute value. Here's an example where the student hopefully would recognize that the inverse symbol here, and then they didn't show their arrows. So arrows are helpful. And here they just thought it just means taking the reciprocal, which is incorrect. All right, for question number 8, it says evaluate the expression below. This is out of 21 points. Sine of an inverse of cosine of -3/4. So we've practiced in class that you should recognize, well, I need to take two trig functions, and the first trig function is I'm going to work with one inside. So here I'm going to put a box around that and make it your favorite variable, sine of x, which means that we need to find at the very end sine of x. So I put a box down here, sine of x equals blank. Now that means that x is equal to everything in the box, so I have an equation here, x equals the inverse of cosine of negative 3/4. So x equals this whole box. You're doing a substitution. Here the inverse symbol, -1, tells you to take the inverse, so switch them. You're left with the 3/4 equals cosine of x. Okay, so we're saying that the unknown angle equals these two sides. Well, in these two sides I have cosine, which is adjacent over the hypotenuse. Now the cosine is here negative, so I'm going to work in quadrants. All students take calculus, so here they're positive, and I can have an answer in either quadrants 2 or 3, but you can pick the one, and I just pick the easiest is I think quadrant 2 because you have only some values negative and other values positive. Cosine is -3, and the reason why it's -3 is because in quadrant 2 when you draw that triangle, think of the bow tie, your x value is going left, so your x values are becoming negative. The hypotenuse here is a distance, so that one will always be positive. Your r value or your hypotenuse is always positive, so then I can use Pythagorean theorem. C squared equals a squared plus b squared. C value is the hypotenuse, which is across the right angle. A and b values are the other legs of the right triangle. So we're using the Pythagorean theorem because we're solving for, we have two sides of a right triangle, and we're trying to solve for the third one. And also a hint that you're using the Pythagorean theorem is that there's no given angle besides the 90. So my a value is -3. Notice my substitution in parentheses. My c value, there it is, substitution is 4. And then my b value is the unknown, which I'm going to solve for. So then I can do 4 squared, 16. -3 squared is -3 times -3, which is +9. And I'm going to solve for b, so subtract 9, I get 7. To solve for b, I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and I'm going to get b equals plus or minus radical 7. Remember, when you're solving here, you can put in a negative radical 7 or a positive radical 7 and get 7. So here, I'm only going to choose the positive because my y value is going up. And then if I take this value, now I have all sides of the triangle. I'm just trying to find sine. Sine is opposite over the hypotenuse. So if I do the opposite, which is radical 7 over the hypotenuse, my answer is radical 7 over 4, positive radical 7 over 4. How did I score this? So normally they're out of 4 points, but to make the test, I differentiated it so that you have level tests, and so this test version was easier. This was out of 21 points. So what I did was a ratio of proportions, 1/4 equals x over 21. So normally if I gave you 1 point, that'd be 5.25, and every point's worth 5.25 points. So you tried the problem, did anything right, you got 5.25 out of 21. If you took the inverse over here, I gave you a total of 2 points, so you couldn't get the rest. 3 points, you had to get a positive radical 7. The most common mistake we'll probably look at in a second. You got 15 points on 5 points if you had a radical 7 but couldn't get to the correct trig function, or if you maybe said a negative. Let's look at some work. So this student tried to take the inverse but didn't set a variable. So I gave him a 1, which is equivalent to 5.25. And yes, going to tutoring does help, but paying attention in class each and every day, 100% focus, is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. This one shows that putting set equal to a variable, they have alpha. They showed taking the inverse. They have their triangle here. Pythagorean theorem is correct, and then correct ratio for sine. The only I gave full credit for this problem. Only thing I would like to see is that this was on the unit circle. Question: graph the following trig functions over one period. Be sure to include a table of values and label your axis clearly. This is out of 24 points. There are 5 points that was 5 criterions that I was looking for. You're looking for the period. I'm looking for the x values or x-intercepts. 1 point for the table. 1 point for accurate graph, like you knew if it was sine, cosine, or tangent. And then I guess it's like location of the graph, and then this one's actually the shape, like the correct. So for example, our problem was cosine, so it's a bucket. If I do a proportion, each point that I normally award is worth 4.8. So there's just, if you got 1 point, or, how many points you would get. It's not based on, well, if you got the period correct, you got 24, that would be incorrect. Graph following trig functions over one period. Oh, we already talked about that. Y equals 2 cosine pi x. So the first thing I'm going to do is write my letters, A, B, C, and D. Therefore, I can identify A value as 2, so that means that's my amplitude, and the graph is not flipping over the x-axis because it's positive. My B value here is the coefficient in front of x or outside the parentheses, so that would be A pi. Here we have cosine, so the period of cosine is 2 pi over b. And if you take your b value and just put it there in the denominator, you can cancel all those pi's and you get 2. Okay, so it means the graph will start and end by 2. There is no c value, there is no plus or minus inside the parentheses, so there is no phase shift. D value, there is no vertical shift because there is no plus or minus here or way out here. Okay, remember that's multiplication. How do you know where the graph will start and end? Well, if you put it between starting at 0 to 2 pi, remember 2 pi comes from that period, I just solve this inequality. If I divide by pi on all the signs there, 0 divided by anything is 0, 2 pi divided by pi is 2, so I'm going to start at 0 and end at 2. And that matches my period here. How do you get your x values? Well, once I chart 0 and 2, I can just find the midpoint between 0 and 2. 0 plus 2 divided by 2 gives us 1. 1 plus 2 divided by 2 is 3 halves. 0 plus 1 divided by 2 is 1 half. And those are my x values or my x-intercepts. And we're just doing the order of operations. We're doing what's inside the parentheses first. So we're going to multiply the x values here by pi. Pi times 0 is 0. Pi times 1 half is pi over 2. Pi times 1 is pi. Pi times 3 halves is 3 pi over 2. And pi times 2 is 2 pi. Here is the golden row for cosine. I call it the golden row because then you can just look at your unit circle and get these values. So when I find cosine at these values, I get 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and 1. And then the last thing I need to do is we're going to multiply by 2. So think about PEMDAS. We did what's in the parentheses, and then here you have, you're kind of considering all this and then the 2. Another neat way to think about it is you're just basically working from right to left. And so if I multiply these values by 2, this is the amplitude 2, 0, negative 2, 0, and 2. And when I graph these at 0, it's 2, 0, 2, 1 half 0, right 1, down negative 2. Here's the order pair 3 halves, 0, so right 3 halves and then 0, stay, and then right 2, up 2. And there's my cosine. Let's look at some work. Student work, everything looks correct, has a nice table, used a ruler. The only thing I took off a point there was for their x values. So even though these are correct, table of values, these values are correct, the x values are wrong, so I took off 4.8. Here's some student work, full credit, 24 out of 24, could have used a ruler, that would have been helpful. Actually, the student should have lost some points because you don't have 3 halves. That should have been 2. This should be 1 less than that. This student has multiple things incorrect. So remember, the period for tangent is pi over b, but cosine is 2 pi over b. Here, this is multiplication, so you would have to divide pi and all these, not subtract. And their x values are incorrect. Here they kind of memorize the golden row for cosine, so they just randomly put it there. Here's a problem. They took off 1 point, their amplitude. So remember, your maximum should be a 2, and also the minimum should be a negative 2. And this one only goes to 1 to negative 1. So let's take a look at their answers. X values are actually incorrect. See, they have the golden row here, but they didn't know how to use it because it's out of order. X values, and you should have multiplied by pi, and then you should have multiplied by 2. That's what I was circling. So this one should have actually lost more points. And so that side was out of 45 points. So 45 and 30 on the front side. Hopefully write your name nice and neatly, circle the period, pre-score, and then if I circled any of these, you lost more points. So that test was out of 75. You can also watch the other tests in to see how their difficulty changed. Good luck.